but the paper today is about the impact of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, on Internet interconnection. It's joint work with Ron Zhuo, Brad Huffaker, and Casey Claffey. Ron is a PhD student at Harvard Business School and Harvard Economics, and Brad and Casey are computer scientists at the University of California at San Diego, with whom we collaborated to do this work. Again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to give the presentation. This is in lieu of making a trip to visit, which I'm sorry didn't take place a couple weeks ago as had been planned. And I'm still happy to give the talk, but I miss meeting everybody. I'm planning to divide the talk into 5 sections and take pauses in between the sections. So if you are looking for opportunities for clarifying questions and you're too shy, that's also another moment to do it. Otherwise, if you have really long questions, we can do it at the end too. And happy to take the time. Here are the 5 sections. Take about 10 minutes for motivation and overview. Then I'll give you some background on the setting. I'm assuming most of the audience are not computer scientists. I'm assuming most of the audience are economics background or maybe a little business background. And so you'll need a little more of a tutorial. And then we'll get into the data and results. Okay, so what question are we after today? The general question is, how does the GDPR affect investment in interconnecting the internet layer? That probably doesn't mean much to you. And so let me at least provide brief definitions. Interconnection here means 2 networks arranged to exchange data. And I'll give a more formal definition in a little while. And the internet layer is everything below applications. That is everything, that is the infrastructure that supports applications and all the networks that support applications. And again, I'll give a much more formal definition in a moment. I also want to say something very practical at the beginning. You may not have known it, but it is not unknown to a small computer science community. I didn't really know it until I did this project. The amount of interconnection in the internet has been growing without interruption for many years because the internet traffic has been growing without interruption for several decades. In addition, if you read all the literature that to date has been written about GDPR by the economics community, it generally comes to the conclusion that GDPR has been imposing costs on a number of application layer firms. In practice, that has a consequence for our research, because it means in practice what our research is going to investigate is the following. Did GDPR slow the rate of growth in interconnection among networks covered by that policy when compared with other networks who are unaffected by that policy? Okay, so just again to have you appreciate where we're going with the paper. So why would you care about this? First of all, I hope you appreciate GDPR is the most important internet policy initiative in the last 2 decades. It's inspired similar laws in other countries. Even in some US states, California has passed its own GDPR. And there are many news articles about it. The industry certainly is very interested. Up until now, all but one study has identified large costs associated with GDPR at the application layer. That is, it has affected applications. And as far as we know, no one's looked at any other layer. And that's interesting in spite of, if you actually do read the regulations, it contains extensive guidance about traffic and storage and other things that are below the application layer. So there should be some interest there. This is probably a given, but we're talking about a very large market. If you look at the United States, where I have most of my familiarity, e-commerce, access revenues, and online advertising come close to $1 trillion a year in revenue. So it's just an enormous economy. Yeah, and then as I'll try to emphasize, it is just not obvious. It was not obvious to us as well before we started what effect GDPR would have on the internet layer, despite a general finding by much research that it has affected the application layer. When we started to try to think about how it would affect the internet layer and interconnection in particular, we weren't sure what margin would be affected, if any, and if it does have an effect, how do we think about the policy consequences from those effects. Okay. So we thought it was a pretty interesting thing to do. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a difference in difference study. I know that's pretty familiar probably to this audience. Just to be clear, the first difference is before and after GDPR, and the second difference is between those networks covered by GDPR and controls. What is a control here? That's going to be other countries in the OECD who are not covered by GDPR. So just to be very concrete, there are 31 countries covered by the GDPR. There are 11 countries that are in the OECD who are not covered by the GDPR, including the United States and Canada. And so it's a substantial part of the internet also that is not covered. And so that's going to be the comparison. I'll give you more details in a moment. And then what we're going to do is use the best data available on global interconnection. This comes from the CADA Institute at the University of California, San Diego, hence our two partners. I'm going to use economics language for a moment. This is not what the computer science community would say, but try to make this understandable. We're going to look at extensive margin, that is to say growth in interconnection. And then we're going to look at an intensive margin, that is to say growth within an existing interconnection. And then we're going to account for what's known as the direction or hierarchy of agreements, which is to say, which is believed to reflect the direction of traffic, okay, and bargaining, negotiating power. Okay, so if you understand that's what we're doing, now here's the, what do we find? Give me a second. First, we're going to observe the growth in interconnection that's generally presumed to be there, and it is everywhere, and it is all over this data. As I say, that's not a surprise, but it's a very useful benchmark, and I don't think it was known by most economists. And just to give you a sense of that, it's one of the things I actually expect you'll walk out from this, appreciating how the internet's growing. The second thing we're going to find is that there's no statistically significant change before and after GDPR at any measurable margin that we can find once we do a comparison against controls. That's going to be true for both extensive and intensive margins, and it's going to be robust to the direction that we look at. In other words, we're not going to see any evidence of GDPR imposing any cost at the interconnection layer. That finding will limit how you interpret GDPR's effect on the internet, and I'll defer that topic until the very end of the talk, because you have to see the detail to understand what we can and cannot see, to understand what its limits and strengths are. Okay, so finally finish the introduction, what's our contribution? We're the first to look at the networking layer. We're very much inspired by many of the other studies, and there are a lot of them, and they're terrific. And given the size and importance of the problem at hand and the policy, it deserves this attention, and it deserves 3 times this attention. So I absolutely like the existing studies. We're inspired by them. We are just looking at a corner of the network that nobody else has looked at. We do think it makes you think differently about what's going on. And I'll just hint at that a little bit. It fosters the interpretation that all the costs of GDPR are being borne at the application layer where the value creation is taking place. Okay, so that's just a hint. There's more coming. In addition, it also will shape your view of the short-run costs. We don't have much to say about the benefits of GDPR, one way or the other, but conditional on using it to understand costs, it shapes a little bit about the way you think about the benefits. So, again, I'll defer that till the end. So that's what our contribution is, and this is a good moment to pause. That's where we're going. What do you think?
Ija Laiponen has a clarifying question. Who are the typical parties in these interconnection agreements? Are these telecom operators?
Some will be. It depends who runs the network. We're going to see several thousand. There are several thousand networks around the globe. Some of them are carriers. So yes, some of them will be telecom operators, cable companies. Some of them will be Google and Amazon, who run some parts of their own network and have an autonomous system and interconnect with others. It's a variety, as it turns out. The vast majority, as I'll tell you in a moment, the vast majority of the sample here will be small and medium networks, most of whom occupy a small number of countries. Not, don't go over many borders, but participate in the global internet. And so to participate, they interconnect with networks in other countries. Hope that helps. Other clarifying questions? Yeah.
Not right now. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right, let's go. So a tutorial about layers. So put on your seatbelts here. Here we go. So we have this picture in the paper to help someone who's never thought about the layers of the internet, about how it works. So most of what you interact with is thought of as the application layer. That's the top part of this picture. Can you see my cursor? Does that? No. Can you see my cursor or not? If I'm pointing at it, no. Okay. So the Google, Netflix, and YouTube, that's at the very top. That's the application layer. The thing is that has to work with something below it, which is generically called the internet layer. It has to exchange data with it. The internet layer is worth quite a lot of money. And yet, for this paper, for this talk, I was trying to find an estimate of its value, and I could not. It's a little difficult to estimate just how big it is. We do know from other data that the value of the application layer is quite high. And just to give you a sense of the magnitudes, electronic retailing in the U.S. is just north of 500 billion in revenue. U.S. wireline access revenue is just north of 87 billion in 2017, the last year that we have the data. Wireless data revenues in the same order of magnitude in the U.S. So just to give you a sense, it's a really substantial economic activity. And what's going on here, something that a computer scientist would call intelligence resides at the edges of the network. So what that means is most of the computation for an action takes place in the application, and then the data communicates with other applications in other locations by translating its data into a packet. That is, into a standardized format for data. The packet is handed off by the application, often your browser, by the way, to a server. The server takes the packet and moves it to into the transport layer, that is across lines, to another server or a router. A router will then direct the packet to other routers or to other servers, and then up at the other end to the applications that are communicating with those applications. In order for all of that to take place, the routers must read the packets. Packets typically have on them a header right at the very beginning that contains address information about the origins and the destination. And the routers will typically take the least congested path for the packets. The routers themselves use something known as routing tables. That is to say, it's a database of all the network by network routes that can be taken to a destination. And those routing tables tend to be updated nightly on the global internet. Okay, just that's a lot to absorb there. But to appreciate what we're about to do, we're about to look inside that all those networks. So we're going to have access to all the routing tables for the entire internet. And we're going to look at the paths that all the data take, and we'll be able to identify when networks hand data off to each other and interconnect, and we'll be able to identify some things about the direction that tends to take, and so on. This is the basic architecture from which we get that. Okay. And just so you recognize it, that's how the internet works. I mean, it's fundamental to the operation of the internet. So the thing about the interconnection is it's been growing ever since the internet became privatized in the early 1990s and became an exploding commercial network in the mid 1990s. And what it means for there to be more interconnection is that there are more paths for sending and receiving data. These paths themselves are actually fairly easy to set up and change to a point. It's like a lot of different things in life. There are fixed costs, and then there are incremental costs. And so I'll just describe briefly what it looks like today. If you are a firm that wants to interconnect with other networks, what do? The typical way you do it is you go to a data center, you physically build a line to a data center where many other firms have already built a line to the same data center. And then you negotiate a contract with other participants at that data center to exchange data. It may be, we'll talk about the negotiation in a moment. Once you're there, to make another interconnection with another firm is actually quite easy. It's just negotiating another agreement. And depending on the number of other firms who are there, it can be dozens, the firms with whom you can make agreements. So when we say, as we do in the paper, it's very easy to make these agreements, the plain fact is a high fraction of them are very easy to do. You're physically already co-resident in a location, and the truth is you've got to just renegotiate things. It's also the case that it's very easy to stop. I would say in practice, having watched this activity for decades, it's very rare for interconnection to be withdrawn. It happens occasionally over disputes. The last major event like this was a big fight between Netflix and the US carriers in 2014. It hasn't happened in a long time that we've had a major dispute. Given the economic conditions we're all living under in the next year, perhaps we'll get one, except that, as it turns out, this particular recession doesn't seem to be affecting the internet. It's having the peculiar characteristic that internet traffic is growing at the same time during the pandemic. So perhaps we won't see disputes. The last thing to say is these are negotiated contracts. They're standardized at this point. They were pretty complicated back 2 decades ago when people were figuring them out. I got to tell you at this point, they're fairly standard. So they're not particularly complicated for the participants. They do take one of 3 forms. Depending on the direction the traffic goes, peer-to-peer, which is the language we will use, means that the two networks are interchanging traffic at about roughly the same volume. When one is a customer to the other and one is a provider to the other, that means the network who is the provider is providing transit services. That is to say, it's receiving a lot more data than it's providing, and it wants to be compensated for that. You know, it wants, you know, it's taking your data and moving it across the continent or something like that, or moving it across the ocean, and it says, you know, pay me. If, on the other hand, it's going the other direction, they're giving you more data than you're receiving, then again, the money will flow in the other direction. And peer-to-peer is when they are within roughly equal volumes. Okay, and there's a lot written about those negotiations, and we have in our appendix, we have a lot to say about that as well. But basically, that's what's going on. In principle, all of this is visible. So that's the last thing to appreciate. We will be able to see all the peering. We'll be able to see pretty much all the interconnection and their status and the identity of the owners. The thing we do not see is the traffic volumes. So we have to infer it. We also, I'll sort of explain this a little bit. We don't see global geography. We see virtual geography. Okay, so we, and the way I would like to explain that is when a network in, let's say a German network, here we'll do this. When a German network wants to exchange data with a US network, it can do it essentially in two different ways, and they're going to be roughly equivalent. One way they can do it is rent lines to get access to a data center in Ireland. And then they'll negotiate the agreement to interchange data in the Ireland data center. And so the US network in that case is renting the network all the way to Ireland. They could have alternatively done it in Nova Scotia. So the German network rents the transatlantic lines and meets in a data center in Nova Scotia, and the US firm exchanges data there. In practice, they probably do both, in which case we'll record two network interconnections. If they're doing just one of those, we'll record just one. But quite frankly, they are technically equivalent from the viewpoint of the internet, and we'll count them as one. And so where it takes place is in some sense not the relevant part. That's why geography doesn't matter. So I know that sounds a little complicated, but this is, by the way the computer science community thinks about it as well.
Shane, let me pause you real quickly. I have
Sure.
3 clarifying questions, and I think this is a good spot here. So
Sure.
Esky is asking, does pricing of interconnection affect the routing?
Does pricing of interconnection affect the routing? No. Okay. The routing, by and large, almost everywhere in the internet is a best effort routing. So that is, it chooses the least, the routers choose the least congested path. Having said that, okay, as an economist, your next initial reaction is, but what's the incentive to build a path? And of course, the incentive to build is you could get compensated for it. So in the short run, no, routers are just engineered to ignore anything other than the shortest path. They'll look for an open path and we'll try to move the data across the best path. In the long run, if you would like to get compensated, you want to build so that your path's open. And particularly in these customer provider networks, there's lots of theory written about this, by the way. So I mean, I'm not telling you anything that's not already in a lot of papers. There's an incentive to build to keep your paths open.
All right. Larry White is asking, does the contract involve something like quality? Isn't that what the Netflix dispute was all about?
Sort of. Yes, and yes and no. I've tried to not get into too much detail. Basically, the way these contracts are written is they have to agree on how much traffic's going back and forth. So the way they typically do that is they make these measurements at various time periods, and they measure peak use, because frankly, when a data line's being used at 25%, nobody cares. So the only time that both parties really care a lot is when you get above something like 85% use. So then what these contracts typically are written, they're written as the fraction of the time that you're above 85% use. And then both parties will have will negotiate compensation based on what fraction of the time in either direction you see it going at more than 85% use. And the Netflix dispute was about whether the carriers would make investments on their side of the interconnection in order to have a larger volume of traffic come in and not be at that 85% quite as high as frequently. And the networks argued in response that they wanted to be compensated in order to do that investment. And that's about as much as I think it's worth getting into. That was and that you know, and then that standoff lasted about 5 months.
Aisha Leiponen is wondering, do the agreements ever or often involve new physical network being built, or are they just about switching on some services within the existing physical networks?
Yes, again, yes and no. The two things that you should really think about, it's a slight oversimplification, but I think it's the two things you should most think about. There's one physical investment that is quite substantial. That is getting a line to a data center where you're going to do interconnection. That can be a substantial investment, particularly if it takes 50 miles or something like that. That can be a lot. That can cost a lot of money. The second thing is rather incremental. It is a physical investment. It's investment in software and an investment in a port to open up traffic to a server. And it can also be the case that you have to put in more servers. So, the physical investment of locating the server and hooking it up is in fact a physical activity. And one of the measures we're going to have here, when we look at IP addresses, you'll see the intensive margin could be interpreted as on either side of the interconnection, you're putting on more servers. That's an interpretation of it. In the greater scheme of things, that kind of investment is tiny in comparison to the other kind of investment, the physical line. Physical line is really quite expensive and can be quite expensive in the millions of dollars. Whereas putting in another server, we're talking a couple $1,000s, and you got to get a technician to go do it. Okay, you might have to get some lines. In the data center, you might have to negotiate with the data center. It takes you a week to get them to put it in the ceiling. I mean, it's, this stuff is mostly trivial.
All right, and one last question by Dan Savell. How does the movement toward cloud hosting change the external layer you are observing? He assumes that communication in the same cloud here, for instance, Amazon, is local, whereas it was not before?
That's a good question. It does complicate things from managing data. It's much more complicated in the cloud. Um, Here's the thing that matters here. Amazon Web Services, from the viewpoint of this data, is one network. As long as the data stays within Amazon Web Services, it's one network. However, if you look at the way Amazon Web Services is built around the world, the data, in fact, moves out of the AWS network into other networks in order to do transit, and then it'll go back into an AWS network in another location. So it's that interconnection between those networks is that where we'll observe it. To the extent that data stays inside, we don't observe it. The place where we think that matters the most is probably within the Google network, especially. Google's made a lot of investments to load balance among its own data centers and its own CDNs and its own, and it's built some of its own lines so that things don't ever leave its own network. Probably as much as anybody in the world. Amazon and Facebook are going down the same path, I should add. We don't, as long as it stays within the network, we can't see it. We only see the interconnections. So that's and that means in practice, as we go forward, that's going to complicate things, certainly over the next 5 years or 10 years.
All right, thanks.
Okay, let's keep going. So finally, why would you think GDPR is going to change anything? Well, so here are the parts that we're going to pay attention to. It's approved in April of 2016 and made effective in May of 2018. Those two dates are what we're going to pay attention to. We're going to look at both. The literature has tended to look at the latter date primarily. As we will as well in practice. We'll test both. It applies only to services within the European Economic Area. As I said, that's 31 countries. It's generally, if you look at the way it's written, there are a number of compliance costs imposed on the firms that were covered by this, and they had to redesign their processes to be in compliance. There is, in addition, what you would call an ongoing operational cost because it imposes some management obligations around personal data, and that raises costs inside of a network. It's also much more complex to store and resell personal data that comes from a European user because of the legal obligations. And so that also is a raised cost. And again, if you read it very carefully, there are restrictions on moving data across borders, particularly any data that's has European personal information in it. In addition to that, there are regulatory costs embedded in the GDPR. It's deliberately written in an open-ended way so that there are going to be further negotiations and subject to change, interpretations that are subject to change. So ongoing regulatory costs. So we expect that to be burdensome. And certainly that's not a crazy idea. A lot of people expect that. We also expect non-compliance outside the outside the European area, just because operational practices were simpler before, and that remains true. And if you're a network that doesn't to do any business in the European area, you have no reason to be in compliance. So our intuition before we started was that the increased operational costs at the application layer would lead to a decline in the traffic, or at least a decline in the growth of traffic, leading to less interconnection.
Shane, can I interrupt briefly?
Yeah.
Martin Peitz has a question. I think this is a good spot here.
Okay, sure.
Only it's to say hi to Shane.
Hey, that's nice to see you.
I have a question in terms of the asymmetry, possible asymmetry of traffic. I mean, the GDPR was, of course, made partly also that people make more deliberate decisions, and that actually may lead to different decisions than what they were taking without the GDPR.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think, for example, about the sending of geolocation data, you would expect that if the GDPR is seen as successful, people will more often reject the sending of those data. So that would suggest that we should see a more asymmetric flow of traffic. And the question is whether you would see that in those data, because some of those data, I mean, they contain very sensitive personal information, but they're actually very low volume data. And therefore, I'm wondering whether you capture that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. So there's two parts to what you're saying. If some data is sensitive and isn't going to move, you would expect it to be asymmetric. I'm totally with you on that. And you would expect it, if it's substantial, to show up in the provider-customer networks. So we were particularly worried about that. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to look at customer-provider interconnection, because we thought one of the ways we might see an effect is precisely having less data going in one direction, but not necessarily in the other. So we're with you. You've also identified really what the interesting exception might be, which is that some of this is text, and so text itself does not occupy a lot of data space, and geolocation data, for the same reason, does not is not a big deal, and so that's also leading towards one of the interesting hypothesis we have for what I'm about to show you, what our finding is going to be, which is that perhaps the big driver here is things like video or streaming that have been stripped of the sensitive information. And so things were redesigned in such a way as to not move that. But on the other hand, the big substantial data that's moving across borders turns out to be the stuff that's doesn't contain any of this personal information. So that's it's an excellent question, and at this point we're still speculating. So once we get there, keep coming back to that. By the way, when we get to the end, okay. Should I keep going? Because that's a great comment there. Okay, so before we finish this, we also read all the white papers. There are tons of them, and many of them were expecting costs to affect traffic. There were these lists of all these firms who were not going to, who closed down their European websites and not take European customers. That should have affected things. There were we were expecting a large aggregate effect for all this to add up. And finally, there was just this, as Martin Ivey was really bringing up, lots of stories about not moving data across borders. And so we were expecting less traffic from that. I have to tell you also, I study data centers, and I have friends in the data center industry, and they were telling me there was this boom in data center growth in Europe in response to GDPR. So that was it's an anecdote, right? But consistent with this. So that's why we were expecting something. Okay. So the next two parts here go pretty quick. If you've followed me up to now, we're good? Okay, data. So the data come from CADA. what they're going to, as I said, we're going to look at the routing tables, and they have various probes everywhere. Identifying a network's owner is actually quite easy. And in practice, we're going to run a diff and diff, and we're going to compare the European Economic Area to another area. How do we do that in practice? So what we're going to do is we're going to assume that the location of the network headquarter indicates something about the regulatory regime in which the network predominantly operates. By and large, that's a pretty good assumption for most of our observations. There are a couple observations in our data who are multinational and global, and you may worry about that. I have to say, though, most of our observations, and there are thousands of them, are small, medium networks that operate in only a small number of countries. So by and large, this is a pretty good assumption. And there are a couple examples where, a couple of observations where that's perhaps not the case. So we want to be clear about that. To run a diff and diff, you could stare at this picture all day. It's easy to say what we're doing. It's hard to implement. That's the way to say it. The easy thing that we're doing here is we're going to take the 31 countries that are sitting inside Europe. We're going to compare them to the 11 countries that are sitting inside the OECD who are not part of the European Economic Area. Right? That's the comparison. Then you ask, well, what comparison do you make? You compare the interconnections that these two different groups are making. Well, exactly which comparison? Well, there are lots of different comparisons you can make. So we can compare the interconnection they make with themselves versus what they make with others compared with themselves. Or we can compare the comparisons each of them makes with 157 other countries in the world that are neither in the OECD or the European area. So there's a bunch of different comparisons, and we'll do all three. Okay, and that's the way to understand what the different diffs are going to be. Key features of the data, it's 2015 to 2019. It's mostly monthly observation. The data set on IP addresses is going to be weekly. It's approximately 200 countries. In fact, it's 199 countries. And then it turns out a bunch of networks are affiliated with the European Union. So that becomes our 200th country, if you like. The routing tables tend to be very accurate. They have to be because that's how you route data. The contracts are not public, but there are standard methods of computer science to infer those direction of contracts. That's why we have a couple computer scientists on our team here. They're very good at this. And so we're just going to use a pretty standard approach. I want to reiterate geography. When I use the word geography here, you should think of country of owner. That's not necessarily the physical point of interconnection. Okay. Now, a few other data points. There are 54 months of data here. And in those 54 months of data, we observe over 7 million monthly observations of agreements. We're going to aggregate that up into country pairs, where we get number of agreements per country pair. So that's going to be 119,000 pair months over 54 months, where we're able to observe contracts. There are, in addition, zeros, that is to say, pairs of countries who otherwise don't have agreements, and we will fill in those zeros. And then when we examine, as we will in a moment, customer, provider, or peers, it's the case that a country pair can have more than one type, particularly country pairs who have networks that are meeting, and some are customers to one and some are providers to the other, or they're pairing across. That will also account for that as well, just so you recognize that. When we look at the IP data, that is when we look at the intensive margin, what we're going to do is we're going to look at existing interconnection, and we're going to ask how many IP addresses are involved in that interconnection. What that's proxying for is traffic. It's not a perfect proxy. We're the first to say that. Nobody measures traffic except the carriers. There's, by the way, in the computer science community, a rather large conversation around measuring traffic. This is a pretty standard way of measuring the depth of interconnection between on an existing interconnection. And as I said earlier, it's proxying, many believe, for how many servers you've got on that interconnection. And so that different IP addresses, then if there's more and more IP addresses, it's sort of saying that there's more and more servers involved on either side and that there's more traffic going. That's the idea. I just want to note that observability is a concern. So if anyone ever, a couple of years from now, wants to do this again, just be careful about October 2018. We put that in the paper because that we wasted. Ron will regale you with stories when we're done. And that's just to tell you, you have to be very careful about what's being observed because different instruments observe different things. Okie dokie. And okay, here we go. So ready for results? I got about 10 minutes to go, is that right? Yeah, cool. Okay, so results. You know, showing you that picture again, it's a bit complicated to display results. The four of us had quite long conversations about how to do that. And just to remind you, pragmatically, the question became, once we started looking at the data, we realized, oh, of course, the question here really is, did GDPR slow the rate of interconnection growth among the networks covered by the policy compared with other networks? That tells you how we're going to show you the results. I could show you a bunch of tables. It would be hard for you to appreciate them. But boy, I can show you some pictures of the extensive margin and some pictures of the intensive margin. And that turns out to be, it gives you the story. Now, there are going to be econometricians on this call, I assume, who know damn well that a picture doesn't necessarily translate into an econometric estimate. And I totally understand that. We get that. We're going to do we did the tables too. It is, however, the case in this data that the pictures are not deceiving you. So I'm going to largely, just given the time, show you the pictures, and you can read the paper if you like. But the econometrics, as it turns out, it's one of those situations where the pictures really tell the story. Okay, and I totally get, if your instinct is wait, we tell our students never to do that. Yeah, I get it, but believe your eyes in this case. Okay, so here we go. Start with really the most obvious thing to do, which is just look at the number of interconnection agreements. Here's a picture. So the way to understand is dots and the X's. The dots are on the bottom of picture A. The X's are on the top. What that's doing is comparing. The dots are the networks within Europe. The X's are the networks in OECD that are not in Europe. Okay, and those are just the number of agreements. And A is the number of agreements with networks owned by countries not in the European area, but are part of OECD. Okay, and what you will observe is they're both growing. The two red lines are the dates in which GDPR are implemented, and the dates at which it was passed and then implemented from the left to the right. And you will notice that the lines continue to grow at roughly the same rate before and after each of those lines. If you stare at this long enough, you might say, wait a minute, the statistics might show something. I agree with you. It might, it doesn't. Okay, but you'd want to test this. But if you just use your eyes here, it sure doesn't look like there's a whole lot going on. And you know what? That's going to be the same story over and over again. that your eyes are actually not deceiving you. So now we can do the same thing with interconnection agreements with other parts of the global internet. Those, either owned by now European OECD countries, that's in B, or we can, B is non-European, non-OECD countries. So that is the 157 countries outside the OECD. And if you look at B, I just recognize what's going on there. The number of interconnection agreements that both US Canadian firms and German and French firms are making with countries outside the OECD has been going up over these 4 years, and roughly at the same rate. And roughly it's the same number of interconnection agreements, by the way. That's what B shows you. And then C is essentially taking what was in A and just flipping it, because now it's agreements with, now Europe is making agreements with its own networks within Europe, and how many interconnection agreements are the non-European ones making with European networks, and that's at the lower end. And again, you see it's just growing, and roughly at the same rate, and there's just not much going on there. In light of time, I'm not going to spend time on this. I could show you the econometric estimates, but it's the same story. Okay, so now I'm just going to flip through the remainder. It's, it's the same kind of exercise. So here is another extensive margin. This is type of agreement. This is Martin's question. We thought, this was where we were going to see all the action. As it turns out, nothing. So even when you control for type of agreement and asymmetry of traffic, same story. What you observe is the growth of agreements. This is parallel to what you just saw in the same way. A little bit of noise, but it's, roughly speaking, it's the same story. Okay, so after you get this finding, you say, well, what about the intensive margin? Surely there's something in the intensive margin. Here, I could have shown you that. Okay, let's just keep going because in light of time. All right, intensive margins. So now let's look at existing interconnection agreements and look at the number of different IP addresses that are involved. Here again, we're comparing the European areas with the OECD areas. It's pretty noisy. This is a pretty difficult thing to do, by the way. Again, here we're just putting on the date of implementation rather than the date of passing. And you can see the B is a real noisy estimate. Those are the log of interconnections with the 157 countries. Very, very noisy connection. It's, A and C are a little bit more reassuring, and neither of them shows much of anything. Arguably, this is one where we look at it and say, well, maybe 2 or 3 years from now, maybe there will be something. But certainly in the year following GDPR, we don't see, the statistics don't yield anything. Okay, and I'm getting to the end here. We did a bunch of things to just double check the answer, like look at the number of agreements within a given area. As it turns out, those are just growing overall at the same rates between both the European area and the OECD non-European areas. It's the same. We did a couple other double checks. Just how about the number of networks? Maybe a number of networks is changing in some interesting way. Nah, they're both growing exactly the same rate. Your eyes are not deceiving you there. How about the reach of the networks? That's otherwise, the computer science community calls this the cone of the network. For those of you who do networking, it's a measure of its centrality. It's how many other networks you can reach. Again, that's not changing. Again, you can stare at this and say, well, maybe in a little while we'll see something. And maybe, but at the moment, no. And so just to summarize, we had all these different measures. We did the difference in difference. And we just didn't find any change whatsoever and no meaningful economic differences. Okay, so I'll take 2 minutes to do an interpretation and then I'll be done. Is that okay?
And one quick question by Larry White. What about the data on the volume of traffic? You said something about data on the volume of traffic. Were you able to get any, and did you look at it?
No, the best you can do in this context is the IP addresses. That's correlated with volume of traffic, or we believe it is, and the computer science community certainly believes it is, and we don't see anything there either. So, you know, arguably, maybe over time you'll see something, but over the first year, no, you don't see anything. Okay, interpretation. I have 2 slides and I'm done. So here's what's in the paper, and I'll just be very upfront. You know, our goal here was not to take a position. Our goal here was to investigate an open research question. And so we find no evidence of GDPR in the interconnection layer, and that's a benchmark against which all future work can measure itself. That is consistent with the view that all the costs for GDPR are borne at the application layer. It's also consistent with a view, sort of that's come up in the conversation, that the effect of GDPR on traffic growth and agreements is small compared to the thing that is driving traffic and agreements. And I would offer that what that means is video and streaming are driving traffic growth worldwide, the growth of those applications. But GDPR is affecting things that are, that can be divorced from that. And so consequently is not showing up in traffic. That's another interpretation. Another interpretation would be that the GDPR is having a limited effect on the internet layer, and most of the value creation in the last few decades has been taking place on the application layer, and so that the incidence of the regulatory costs are aligned with the value creating activities. Whether you like that or not, that's another interpretation. And then the last thing we would say as concern, we are only looking at short run effect. It's a year out. We don't see traffic in a direct form, even though we know that streaming and video are growing. And we cannot see inside the biggest networks where they could be making operational and restructuring choices in the way they run their networks, and we would be unable to measure that. Okay, one more slide and I'm done. This is not in the paper. Okay, so I did not coordinate this with my co-authors, but I thought for an audience like this, you might find this useful for interpreting what we just did. So what would an advocate do with this paper? Having hung out with advocates long enough, we are not advocates, just to be clear. The paper is not taking a position. That's not, this is just me talking. I'm just helping advocates tell you this is what you're going to do with it. One interpretation you might have made of what we found here is that the costs of GDPR are borne by the value creating companies. If you thought that value creation was a good thing for society, then you would say that this is taxing the source of the improvement. If you thought that value creating activity imposed a burden on society by violating privacy, you would then argue that it's targeted the regulation to the place where it's having the largest incidence. So that's just what an advocate would say. If you do or don't want these policies in other jurisdictions, what might you say from our finding? If you do want them in other jurisdictions, you would say there's no evidence GDPR imposes costs on network infrastructure. If you don't want them, you would say, and you regard this as a big waste of time and money, you would then say, not only that, it has no effect on traffic. So it's really a big waste of time and money. Finally, I'll end with the Chicago view. if you had a Chicago outlook and a particularly cynical Chicago view of the regulatory capture, you might interpret this as a group with particular preferences captured the policymaking process and imposed their preferences on the policymaking process. And you would immediately be asking the question after this paper, how did the infrastructure firms manage to influence the regulatory scope in order to limit their own costs? So just to give you a sense of where different economic advocates would come from. Okay. That's all I have to say. Thanks for all your attention.